It's May 1989, Las Vegas, Nevada. Inside the California Hotel and Casino, a man has been standing at the same craps table for 6 hours. The pit bosses have noticed. They always notice. But there's nothing to notice, not really, because the man isn't cheating, he's just winning. And he won't stop. By the time the sun comes up the next morning, he'll still be there. By the time the second sun comes up, he'll still be there. 18 hours. 18 unbroken hours at a single craps table. One of the most random games ever devised by human hands. And this man, this quiet, unassuming man from Honolulu, will have thrown the dice more than 500 times without rolling a 7. The odds of that happening are so astronomical that mathematicians will later argue about whether it's even possible. Casino executives will pore over the surveillance footage looking for signs of cheating and find nothing. Statisticians will run the numbers and come back pale. Because what Stanley Fujitake did on that May night in 1989 shouldn't have happened. Not in a casino. Not on planet Earth. Not in any universe governed by the same laws of probability the rest of us live inside. This is the story of Stanley Fujitake, the man they would call the Golden Arm, the man who turned a pair of casino dice into something that defied every law of chance ever written. And it all began, as these stories so often do, far from Las Vegas. Stanley Fujitake was born and raised in Hawaii. He was not a mathematician. He was not a statistician. He had no background in probability theory or gaming science. He was, by most accounts, an ordinary working man, the kind of person you'd pass on the street without a second glance. He was in his mid-50s by the time the night in question arrived. He had the hands of a man who'd worked for a living, and the face of a man who'd spent time outdoors, and there was nothing about his appearance that suggested legend. He'd been coming to Las Vegas for years, the way many people from Hawaii do. The California Hotel, tucked a block off the main strip on Ogden Avenue, had long been a destination for Hawaiian visitors. The casino understood this and leaned into it, staffing the floor with Hawaiian-born dealers and managers, hanging Hawaiian art on the walls, serving food that felt like home. For a working-class family from Honolulu, it was a place you could be comfortable. It wasn't the Bellagio, it wasn't Caesars. It was a neighborhood casino with good food and familiar faces. And Stanley Fujitake had been walking through its doors for as long as anyone could clearly remember. He liked craps. It's important to understand what that means. Craps is a dice game, and at its core, the game is almost entirely governed by chance. The shooter, the person rolling the dice, establishes a point number on their first roll, then tries to hit that number again before rolling a 7. Roll a 7 before hitting your point, and you lose. It sounds simple. What it means in practice is that every roll is an independent event. The dice don't remember what happened before, they don't get tired, they don't favor anyone. Every roll is a fresh start, and the probability of any given outcome is fixed and unchanging. The one thing a shooter can control, to some small degree, is how they throw. Dice mechanics, grip, angle, spin, release, form an entire subculture in the craps world. And serious players study them the way golfers study swing mechanics. There are dice coaches. There are forums dedicated to it. There are people who spend years trying to find an edge in the way their hands move through space. Whether any of it actually produces consistent results is something the casino industry and the math world have argued about for decades. Stanley Fujitake, if he had a system, never explained it clearly to anyone afterward. He was not the type to give seminars. He was not the type to write a book. He was the type to show up at the California Hotel, step up to the craps table, and start rolling. The night of May 28, 1989, began like any other. The California Hotel's craps tables were operating normally. Dealers were rotating, players were coming and going. The casino floor had that particular late evening energy. Not quite the frenzy of midnight, not quite the quiet of early morning. Somewhere in between, a steady hum. Stanley Fujitake stepped up to the table. He bought in. He picked up the dice. He rolled. The dice came up good. He rolled again. Good again. The thing about a craps roll going well is that it doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with fanfare. You get one good roll, then another, and you tell yourself it's just the start of a decent run, because every player has had decent runs. 10 rolls without a 7 isn't unusual. 20 rolls isn't particularly remarkable. Even 30 or 40 can happen on a good night, and experienced players know not to get too excited too fast. But somewhere around the 40th or 50th roll, the table began to change. Players who'd been casually watching started to lean in. The bets got bigger. New players materialized from nowhere, drawn by something they couldn't quite name. A shift in the atmosphere, a change in the quality of the noise, the particular gravity that forms around a table when something extraordinary is happening. Stanley Fujitake kept rolling. The pit bosses were watching now. They're always watching, that's their job. But they were watching with a different kind of attention. The kind that makes notes. The kind that gets other pit bosses involved. He rolled a 7th time, an 8th, a 9th. He hit his point. He established a new point. He rolled through it. The dice kept coming back to his hands, because when you're the shooter and you're not throwing a 7, the dice keep coming back. Over and over, again and again. By the time he'd been at the table for 2 hours, people were crowding 3 and 4 deep around the rail. By the time he'd been there for 4 hours, the crowd had spread into the surrounding area. There were people standing on chairs. There were people who'd been called over from the slots and the blackjack tables by friends who'd come to find them specifically, who'd said, "You need to come see this right now. You need to come see what's happening." Stanley Fujitake said very little. He picked up the dice. He held them in a particular way. He threw them in a particular way. And they came upright, again and again. The mythology of gambling is full of hot streaks. Everyone who's spent time in a casino has a story about a night when nothing could go wrong. Players talk about being in the zone, about feeling the dice, about knowing before they roll what's going to come up. Most of the time, these stories are nostalgia shaped by selective memory. The wins stick, the losses blur. The human brain is not a reliable historian of its own luck. But the craps world also has its legitimate legends. Players who went on documented, verified, witnessed runs that couldn't be explained away by faulty memory or wishful thinking. The Golden Arm Club, a distinction created by the Horseshoe Casino in Las Vegas, was given to players who held the dice for 1 hour or more without sevening out. It had been awarded a handful of times since it was established, always with the kind of reverent ceremony the casino world reserves for its genuine miracles. Stanley Fujitake hadn't been thinking about the Golden Arm Club when he stepped up to the California Hotel's table. He'd been thinking about the next roll, the way all craps players think, one roll at a time. By the time he'd been rolling for 2 hours, he'd already entered territory that most craps players never reach. By the time he'd been rolling for 4 hours, he'd exceeded what most people would describe as a good night. By the time he'd been rolling for 6 hours, 6 unbroken hours at the same table, the same dice in his hands, the same fundamental physics of throw and land. The word that was spreading through the California hotel was not hot or lucky. The word was impossible. The money on the table had reached a level that required the casino to bring in additional chips. Players who'd started with modest bets had pyramided their winnings into stacks that towered over the rail. New players had bought in with hundreds and were now looking at thousands. The bets on the pass line, on the come bets, on the place bets, 6, 8, 5, 9, were accumulating in a way that was making the casino's back rooms very nervous. And Stanley Fujitake kept rolling. Around the 9th hour, a calculation was running in the heads of everyone watching who understood craps math. Every roll without a 7 narrows the probability of survival by a factor that's both calculable and nauseating if you think about it too hard. The probability of any given roll being a 7 is 1 in 6, about 16.7%. That means, on any given roll, the shooter has roughly an 83% chance of survival. Sounds comfortable, right? But compound that over hundreds of rolls, and the cumulative probability of never throwing a 7 becomes something that makes statisticians reach for their antacids. The exact number of rolls Stanley Fujitake made that night has been reported differently across various accounts. Some say 332. Some say closer to 500. The casino's own records have never been made fully public, and Fujitake himself, in the interviews he gave afterward, was not particularly interested in pinning down exact figures. What is not disputed, what is verified by the casino staff who were there, by the players who stood at that rail, by the management team that was monitoring the situation in real time, is that he rolled for 18 hours. 18 consecutive hours without sevening out. He broke the Golden Arm record. He didn't just break it, he shattered it. He more than doubled the previous longest verified roll in casino history. As the night turned into morning and the morning turned into afternoon, the California hotel took on a quality that regular visitors said they'd never seen before or since. It wasn't exactly a party. There was too much tension for a party. The way a very close championship game isn't exactly fun. It's something else, something with more edges. But it was alive in a way casinos rarely are. There's a particular kind of collective human experience that happens when a group of strangers witnesses something they know they'll be talking about for the rest of their lives. That's what the California hotel felt like. The staff was rotating around Fujitake's table in shifts, but Fujitake wasn't rotating anywhere. He was eating food brought to him at the table. He was drinking water at the table. When nature required, the story goes, he found ways to manage that disrupted as little as possible, because the dice were in his hands, and he was not about to put them down. Players at the table were making extraordinary sums. There are accounts of individual players winning tens of thousands of dollars off this single roll. The general consensus is that the total won by all players at the table during those 18 hours ran well into the hundreds of thousands of dollars. The California hotel, as the house, was absorbing all of it on the wrong side of the ledger. The casino management had options. In theory, casinos can end a game, can ask a player to leave, can close a table. In practice, doing any of those things while a shooter is mid-roll, surrounded by players who are winning, in full view of dozens of witnesses, is an action that would result in a very particular kind of catastrophe, the kind involving lawyers and news cameras and years of bad reputation. So the California hotel did what any casino in that situation would do. They kept the table open. They kept the dice in his hands. They watched. The pit bosses examined the dice repeatedly during legitimate breaks in the action. They found nothing wrong with them. Surveillance cameras watched every throw from multiple angles. The footage was reviewed as it came in, looking for any sign of loaded dice, of a concealed device, of any physical manipulation that could explain what was happening. They found nothing. The throws looked ordinary. The dice landed the way dice land. There was no mechanical explanation. There was no explanation at all. Stanley Fujitake had been a regular at the California hotel for years, and the staff knew him. This fact cut both ways for the casino's investigation of what was happening. On one hand, a known regular is less likely to be running a sophisticated scheme. You don't build up years of credibility and regularity to spring one massive con. The risk calculus doesn't work out. On the other hand, a known regular would know the casino's procedures, its camera angles, its protocols. It would be the perfect cover, but they could never find anything. Not then, not in the months that followed, not in the years of scrutiny that came afterward. What happened at the California hotel in May 1989 was, as far as anyone with access to the evidence has ever been able to determine, legitimate. One man, one pair of casino dice, 18 hours, no 7. There is a particular kind of madness that this fact induces in people who understand probability. The mathematician's instinct is to say, this cannot have happened. The observer's instinct, looking at the documented evidence, is to say, it did. These two facts sit next to each other, and they do not resolve. They simply exist together, uncomfortable and unmoving. The craps community has never fully agreed on how to think about it. The dice control advocates point to Fujitake as evidence that skilled throwing can influence outcomes. The purists say that no physical skill can change the fundamental mathematics of independent random events, and that Fujitake was simply an extreme outlier, a man who happened to be at the end of the normal distribution where extraordinary things live. Both camps have arguments. Neither camp has proof sufficient to silence the other. What no one disputes is the result. When the roll finally ended, and all rolls end always eventually, the California hotel exhaled. Stanley Fujitake stepped back from the table. He had been on his feet, dice in hand, for 18 hours and some minutes. He was exhausted in the way that people are exhausted after enduring something that shouldn't be survivable. Not broken, but emptied, as though the effort had burned something clean. The exact figure he personally walked away with has been reported variously. Some accounts say he won approximately $5,000 for himself, a figure that seems small given the scale of the event, but craps players are in many ways more conservative with their own money than the table dynamics suggest. He was not betting recklessly. He was rolling carefully. The spectacular profits went to the other players at the rail, the players who'd pyramided their come bets and pressed their place bets and let their winnings ride through hour after improbable hour. What Fujitake got was something harder to quantify. He got the record. He got the title. He got, in the small world of craps and in the larger world of gambling legend, a kind of immortality. The California hotel inducted him into what they called the Golden Arm Club with a formal ceremony. They gave him a trophy. They took photographs. They made him a fixture of the casino's own mythology. Because what better marketing exists for a craps table than a verified account of an 18-hour roll? The casino that had lost money on that night was smart enough to understand that the story was worth more than the losses. Word spread. It always spreads. The gambling press picked it up. The Las Vegas papers ran pieces on it. And slowly, the way these things happened before the internet made such stories travel at the speed of light, the name Stanley Fujitake began to move through the craps world like a whispered prayer. The years that followed were quieter for Stanley Fujitake. He was not the kind of man who sought the spotlight, and the spotlight, finding him anyway, never really knew what to do with him. He gave interviews, but he was modest in them. He didn't claim any particular technique with the confidence of a man selling a system. He spoke about the role the way someone might speak about a dream they had. Vivid in memory, strange in retrospect, not entirely explicable even to the person who experienced it. He continued to play craps. He came back to the California hotel. He was treated in the way casinos treat their legends, with something between reverence and commercial interest. A living attraction, a man whose presence at the table drew other players the way a name above a marquee draws an audience. People wanted to stand next to him. They wanted to be at the rail when he rolled, believing perhaps that whatever force had guided his hands on that May night in 1989 might still be there, might be contagious, might rub off on whoever was standing close enough. It didn't repeat. The 18-hour roll never happened again. But that's the nature of the thing. It happened once. It happened completely, and it was enough. There is a version of this story that tries to explain it, and that version is ultimately unsatisfying, because the explanation never quite fits the shape of the fact. The dice control community will tell you that skilled shooters can influence outcomes through consistent grip and release mechanics, that the randomness of dice is less than the mathematics assumes because the mathematics assumes ideal throwing conditions that no human achieves. The academic community will tell you that the evidence for dice control is, at best, anecdotal, and that extraordinary rolls are mathematically inevitable given the total volume of craps rolls occurring at any given moment across all casinos. That somewhere, sometime, the extreme tail of the distribution was going to produce exactly this. That Stanley Fujitake was simply the man who happened to be standing at that particular end of the curve. There is also a third version, which isn't really an explanation at all, but which might be the most honest of the three. Sometimes things happen that we can't fully account for. Not because the laws of physics were suspended, but because human beings are enormously bad at intuiting the behavior of probability at the extremes. We feel in our bones that an 18-hour craps roll is impossible. The math tells us it was improbable. These are not the same thing. The impossible never happens. The improbable, given enough time and enough throws, always happens eventually. Stanley Fujitake happened to be the eventually. The record he set that night at the California hotel in May 1989 has been the subject of challenge and comparison in the decades since. Other players have had extraordinary rolls that ran hours, rolls that filled the crowd around the rail and emptied the casino's chip reserves. But the 18-hour roll remained the benchmark against which all others were measured. It sat in the record books the way certain athletic achievements sit, acknowledged and unrepeated, waiting for the person who might someday approach it. Whether that person will ever come is a question the dice haven't answered yet. What do we take from a story like this one? It's tempting to frame it as a story about luck, and in the most fundamental sense, that's what it is. Stanley Fujitake was a man who got lucky. extraordinarily, historically, mathematically insulting lucky on one long night in Las Vegas. But there's something that resists that framing, something that insists on more. Because luck of this magnitude, sustained over this length of time, begins to feel like something else. It begins to feel like will, like endurance, like the particular stubbornness of a man who simply will not seven out, who holds his point against all probability, who keeps throwing long past the moment when any reasonable person would expect the dice to turn. The Golden Arm record is not just a gambling story. It's a story about what happens at the intersection of chance and perseverance. About what occurs when the random universe, for reasons no one fully understands, decides to align itself with one particular pair of hands for one particular night. You can call it luck. You can call it skill. You can call it the tale of the distribution finally being represented. But if you were standing at that rail in the California hotel in May of 1989, watching the chips pile up and the dice come back and the hours disappear, you wouldn't have called it any of those things. You would have called it something you'd never forget. Stanley Fujitake picked up the dice one more time. He held them the way he always held them. He threw them the way he always threw them. And they came up right.